Continuing the critique of consent, the critique of the idea espoused by John Locke and others, the idea that the government rests on the consent of the governed. We're going to question some of those ideas and look into them a little bit deeper to see if government can really truly be said to be resting on consent, even if it is a democratic government. And the way I do that is to talk about it with these kind of stick figures, or I draw them, to talk about these different thought experiments in which is consent enough? Is it enough that someone votes? Is it enough that someone pays taxes? Is it enough someone follows the law? In what categories are consent, is consent legitimate or not legitimate? And I've discussed some of those in the previous video. Now, one of the questions we have to ask is the consent of the strong enough? We said that the stronger party, now that may be stronger in physical strength, stronger in numbers, stronger in ability, is if just those people agree, stronger in convenience, they may be conveniently located to where a government decides it will come into existence, and so they get to be a part of it, stronger in some aspect. Are we saying it's really okay if the strongest people in a society agree to rule over the weak? Does that mean that the weak have implicitly consented to their rule because enough strong people agreed? Is it okay for the strong to rule over the weak, and not only to rule over the weak, but if the strong agree together to enslave or make subservient the weaker members, is that morally acceptable, and have the weaker members, by their weakness, consented to strength? That's what we're asking. Is consent based on fear of a stronger party and their sanctions or actions against you if you do not fall in line, if you do not obey, if you do not pay taxes, if you do not serve them, whatever the case may be? Does this mean that the consent of the strongest party is all that is needed to justify any government? Because remember, Locke's argument was very focused toward that government has a very limited role to protect life, liberty, and property. And that legitimate government rests on the consent of the people, is laid in the consent of the people. Now, from that argument, he continues on to talk about how he believes consent can be established. And he runs into and tries to deal with a problem. Are we really saying that we have to get the literal consent of every single person? Because he is arguing that government, legitimate government, receives its legitimacy through the consent of the people. So what this would mean, of course, is consent in any normal context means that a person has a voluntary choice to agree or disagree. If they agree, they are bound by what they have consented to. And if they disagree, they are not bound by the offer made. Just like a contract, they are bound by a contract if they sign. But if they don't sign, they are to be left alone. They are not bound to follow the stipulations of the contract. But the problem John Locke runs into is that this would be improbable or impossible. Because could you really get the consent of every single person? There are elderly people, there are sick people, and there are what we may call holdouts or curmudgeon, people who are saying, no, I'm just going to say no matter what. Would it be possible? So what John Locke lands on is what I really mean by the consent of all is the consent of most. Okay, well, if most people agree, I mean, at least we have some surface validity that we can see in that if most people agree to a thing, that's what most people want, and you can't make everybody happy. We get that. But with government, we're talking about the use of force against others. And Locke talks about the limitation of that to criminal activity, to protect life, liberty, and property. So what he ends up saying implicitly is that some people, whoever happens to be the majority of the people who vote, should rule over others, which is not necessarily government by consent. Just because you are outvoted does not necessarily mean that you have consented to the system. Now, see my previous video for the, well, why don't you just leave argument? You pay taxes, you obey the law, you receive services. Because I think those are problematic as well. Now, it sounds at least somewhat reasonable to say, well, by consent, we mean the consent of the majority party. However, why doesn't it sound as reasonable to say, well, when we say consent, we mean the consent of the strongest people? The strongest people get together and they agree that they can rule over the weakest. That the weakest don't have any rights, they don't have any standing, that they, by not being strong, are not able to overthrow the system, therefore they have consented to it because for their survival. And so the question we should take a little bit further is, aren't we saying the same thing when we say a majority ought to rule over a minority? That the majority voters, their consent is the only thing required for the actions of government? Can governments do anything just as long as a lot of people at one time agree to it? These are all questions we have to think about carefully and answer. This is only the consent of the strongest party, not the consent of all. Okay, so if it's illegitimate for the strongest to rule over the weakest, then we could also make the argument that it might be, in many cases, illegitimate for the many to rule over the few, or the few to rule over the many. Basically, any situation in which people are forcefully ruling over other people, except in what Locke would say that limited capacity. But this is where his argument gets stuck, is on consent. The strongest party consents in subjecting the weaker to their control. Now, this could work out in several examples. This could mean if men happen to be the strongest, men could overpower women. If they all just consent together, is that legitimate? Masters could consent to rule over slaves. But by enslaving them does not mean that the slaves have submitted or consented or approved the system. Rich could rule over the poor. The organized could rule over the unorganized. None of these would be accepted as legitimate, yet when we say the majority should rule over the minority, are we really saying something that much different? I don't have a slide for it in here, and I'm a Star Wars guy, not a Star Trek guy. But Spock from Star Trek had this line where he said, the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few or one. And we operate by that principle. But can the government really operate that way in a legitimate way if we're arguing consent? That if a lot of people consent to something, it's okay to sacrifice the rights and the liberties and even the humanity of the few or one. Large questions. If the stronger group agrees and consents to controlling the weaker group, is it legitimate? Now, stronger by physical force or stronger by numbers? And what I would ask Locke, were he still alive, I think he'd be a fascinating individual to talk to, is this: why make consent your argument, the consent of all your argument, if you're then going to admit, but we can't really get the consent of all people? Why make consent the center of your argumentation if what you really mean is the consent of the majority, not just the majority of people, just the majority of the people who happen to vote? I think it may be problematic to center all government simply in the consent of the governed. There has to be more to it than that. Here's a real historical example. It's from the Melian Dialogue. It's from Thucydides' History of the Peloponnesian War, that everybody's read. Just kidding. Nobody really reads this stuff. Athens is in a war against Sparta. They have joined together to fight the Spartans. And they want Melos, this little island, the Melians, to join them in their fight against Sparta. Now, the Athenians are a militarily strong group, and they come to the island and they give them an option between two choices. Now, sometimes people try to get tricky, get cunning, and avoid these two choices. But I don't think there is a third option because they don't allow one. Okay? Choice number one: join us in this fight against Athens, which means giving up your independence and your rights, not to be conscripted, not to be forced to fight in a war in which you do not want to participate. Join us, or you will become our enemies. We will destroy your cities. We will kill people. We will rape people. We will burn Melos to the ground. Join or die. Join, losing your independence, or die maintaining your principle of independence. And the Melians argue their rights. They say, well, no, we have our rights. We're an independent city. We're an independent island. And the Athenians have a discussion with them, and they say, but we're stronger. The strong have the right of making the weak obey them. That is our right in our strength. Now, is this consent? What if they allowed the Melians to vote on it? They do allow the Melians to debate with them, but the result is going to be the same. Force or the threat of force will be used, and you have two choices: join us or die. What would you decide if you were in the Melians' place? Now, some people say, well, I wouldn't fight at all. I would join Sparta or these things. But if you, between those two choices, some people say, I would fight them. Okay, and that is one of the options. But you're going to lose. The Athenians are the ones with this huge military force, powerful army, navy to destroy you. You will lose. So is it really worth it on principle to win your principle, but to be killed? And then consider this, that it's not just you, it's your decision to fight them affects everybody else. Everybody else gets killed, raped, beaten, enslaved. Now, is this consent? Is it true consent? Because there is a choice given. They're between two unpleasant options. That's life in many cases. You're between two choices that you can perceive, that you don't want to choose either one, but sometimes you have to choose. Would it have been consent if they said, yes, we'll fight with you, because our other choice is death? In normal contracts, this is known as duress, Duress. It's a legal concept known as duress, which means if I want someone's car and I offer to pay for it, and someone gives me their car, that's fine. But if I pay for it and I took out a gun and I said, you're going to give me your car, here's some money, drove away, that would be duress. It's the concept of forcing someone to make a contract or a choice or consent to something that they would not have normally consented to because they were threatened or had force used against them. This could be said to be duress. But I mean, they do have a choice. A robber comes into my house, going to steal my TV. And he says, give me your TV. He holds up a gun. Give me your TV or I'm going to blow your head off. I have two choices. Give the TV. I could fight, but risk getting my head blown off. Give him the TV, get my head blown off. But let's say he's a really nice guy. He's a robber, but he's a nice guy. And he says, you know what? I'm going to give you 30 minutes for you to argue with me on why you ought to keep your TV. And so I argue with him. I tell him that I watch Netflix. I tell him about my favorite shows. I show him my, maybe DVD and Blu-ray collection, talk about how much I love movies, show him my Hulu, maybe, play a few clips for him, and then argue about how much I love my TV. Argue logically why I need my TV. Argue that he shouldn't steal my TV, that it's morally wrong for him to do so. I make all these arguments. 30 minutes ends, my speaking time is up. And he again holds up his gun and says, give me the TV or I'm going to blow your head off. Now, just because he let me argue with him, and I end up giving him the TV because I don't want to get my head blown off, doesn't mean that I've consented. The millions, does it mean that they've consented because they were given this choice, join or die? And what the millions actually did is they didn't consent. They said no. Milos was burned to the ground. People were killed, enslaved, women raped, children killed. And that's a true story. Now, when someone threatens force against you and then gives you choices, is that truly consent? Because that's how we have to think about the role of government. Government is force. And so just because we vote, just because we pay taxes, just because we follow laws, how do we know that we really have consented to the government if we acknowledge that we have at all? And so that is something to consider. That when is consent a legitimate category and when is it not? With the threat of force involved, can consent, voluntary, true consent approval exist? And is that really, as Locke argued, is that really the solid foundation for a legitimate government? Or does legitimate government rest in something else?